All right. So before I get started on my talk, I'd like to thank the chapter for my Denker Fellowship this year, and it has been a crazy year. So I haven't been as active with the chapter as I envisioned earlier in the year, especially after I moved back to Texas and then kind of became overloaded with everything. But I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person at future events once I'm back in the area and after the pandemic mess is hopefully behind us and we can have in-person events again. Um, so for my talk today, I wanted to share some of what I've been working on recently. And as many of you know, before I started my PhD in English literature at the University of Maryland, I earned my master's degree in German literature and a graduate certificate in book history from Texas Tech University. And appropriately, given my interdisciplinary training, my research focuses on Anglo-German print culture and the transnational book trade throughout the long 18th century. So last year at the AFA conference that was held in College Park at the UMD campus, I presented one piece of that work concerning the use of Roman and Blackletter type and German language texts printed in the American colonies. My work also considers the reception, translation, and adaptation of English language texts in German-speaking contexts and vice versa. So I have an example here of Daniel Defoe's wildly popular and influential Robinson Crusoe from 1719, as well as a German adaptation called Robinson Jr. from 1779 by the author Joachim Friedrich Campe. And this was a book that educated whole generations of Germans in colonizing skills. So you see that there's this kind of readaptation of English source material for like a different German context. And this work is often overlooked by scholars of English literature because there's a language barrier or they're just not aware of it. So I feel that my kind of unique interdisciplinary training sort of prepares me to undertake this kind of work. And my talk today focuses on a similar textual situation, but instead of Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, I'm looking at Samuel Richardson's The History of Sir Charles Grandison. So a little bit of context for my work on Richardson. I've been fascinated by him since I first started studying 18th century literature during my English undergraduate degree. And I was first drawn to him because of his identity as both a printer and an author, and the fact that he had a very different upbringing from many of the other celebrity authors of the mid 18th century, such as Lawrence Sterne or Henry Fielding, especially due to his parents' lack of financial means. He grew up fairly poor and had a kind of middle class living once he became a printer, and then accumulated more wealth once he acquired some literary fame due to his novels. And though the situations are obviously radically different, I also saw a part of myself in him. I'm a first generation student from a lower middle class family. I study literature and I'm also a trained letterpress printer. I was also, and I continue to be, intrigued by the conflicting and ambivalent reception of Richardson and his novels by critics not only in the 18th century, but also present day academics. Scholars such as Peter Saber, Betty Schellenberg, Jocelyn Harris, and others note that Richardson's been labeled by many as a sober, moralizing, controlling, and stubborn champion of the conservative middle class status quo of his time, embarrassingly and often obnoxiously obsessed with his own image and the praise for his writing. But others characterize Richardson as a reformer, a fierce advocate for women, an innovator, and a progressive who rose to prominence through his dedication to sophisticating the novel genre and what we now usually refer to as a larger umbrella of print culture. I tend to agree with the latter, more liberal characterization of Richardson, but I also understand and find it hard to dismiss or invalidate uh, these criticisms of his more conservative characteristics, such as his emphasis on didacticism and moralizing through a hyper-Protestant worldview constructed heavily around notions of feminine virtue. A 2016 piece in the New York Times written by a contemporary novelist, Adele Waldman, best captures this dichotomy with her article's subtitle, Loving and Loathing Samuel Richardson, and I typically tend to feel this way about him. But these multifaceted understandings of Richardson's identity heavily contribute to the range of criticism on him as both a printer and an author, as well as the novels he wrote. Recently, I've thought about the ways in which his epistolary novels resonate deeply with new technological affordances, such as text messaging and tweeting, which are our own kinds of writing to the moment, which is how Richardson himself theorized epistolarity, as well as various contemporary movements such as #MeToo and Brexit. Given that Richardson never left England in his lifetime and that he knew no language other than English, I've been increasingly interested in projects that examine his involvement in the international book trade via the printing of his novels in foreign context, his correspondence with foreign printers and booksellers, and his interest in international copyright law, which was not something that existed in the 18th century. Richardson's three novels, Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, Clarissa, The History of a Young Lady, and The History of Sir Charles Grandison, and their various bibliographic histories all prove useful for examining his embeddedness within the international book trade and burgeoning English nationalism. Responding to Richardson's scholar Albert J. Rivero's claim that there is, quote, no colonial or post-colonial Richardson, no ecological Richardson, and very little on Richardson and race or empire or slavery, end quote, within current critical conversations of his work, my research examines the ways in which Richardson positioned his novels at the forefront of conversations about English nationalism and superiority through his dual role as a celebrated printer and author. Richardson's connection to English nationalism through his printing and literary endeavors can best be seen in his last novel, The History of Sir Charles Grandison. I was going to give a really concise plot summary of the novel. It's fairly long, so this is less of a summary and more of an overview of kind of the main central conflict. It's a very long kind of doorstopper novel. But the central plot concerns Harriet Byron, who's the main protagonist of the novel, and she's the romantic interest of many young men whom she attracts after moving from London, though none of them are particularly interesting to her. Chief among them is a man named Sir Hargrave Pollexfen, who's a wealthy libertine, kind of an 18th century frat boy. And after Harriet repeatedly rejects his advances, he orchestrates having her kidnapped from a masquerade where she's abducted and carried off by one of his friends, first to a house in Paddington, and then later to his house in the country. And while she's being transported to the country house, she's saved by none other than Sir Charles Grandison, a stranger who sees her struggling in a carriage swap moment. Harriet's rescue then has two results for the following plot of the novel. First, Sir Charles is called upon to fight Sir Hargrave in a duel, which he avoids participating in by delivering a homily on the evils of dueling, a tactic he uses in the later half of the novel to avoid dueling another one of Harriet's suitors, the persistent Mr. Greville. And second, Harriet finds herself falling in love with him. Despite Harriet's infatuation, however, Sir Charles makes no advances, and because of the epistolary frame of the novel, we're not always really in his head, and we're not quite sure what he thinks about her. We get more of her kind of stream of consciousness, writing about her emotional state back to friends and family members. So eventually, though, he reveals to Harriet that some years before, when he was first abroad in Italy, he became attached to the Della Porretta family after rescuing Geronimo Della Porretta from a group of assassins. And he was then brought into their household, where he became their daughter Clementina Della Porretta's English tutor, and the two fell in love. The family drafted up a marriage proposal, but Sir Charles rejected the terms because it conflicted too strongly with his English identity, especially his Protestant religion, and he returned to England. But in the meantime, Clementina fell into a kind of madness upon losing him, and the family writes to Sir Charles to beg him to return to Italy in order to renegotiate the terms of their union. So after leaving the sad Harriet behind in England, Sir Charles returns to the Della Porretta family, and things begin to look a little bit more optimistic for the union between Sir Charles and Clementina, until she abruptly breaks things off, maintaining that her love for Sir Charles is great, but she cannot marry what she calls a heretic. Again, this kind of like Catholic versus Protestant tension. After that, Sir Charles returns to English and begins to officially court Harriet, and they're eventually engaged and married. But then Clementina reappears in England, seeking refuge from an unwelcome Italian suitor, and is graciously received by both Sir Charles and Harriet after their wedding. And then the entire Della Porretta family follows her and is likewise graciously received in England. But while there, Sir Charles convinces Clementina to accept the advances of the Italian man that she's fleeing from. And the novel closes with the departure of the Italian guests all back to Italy. And Sir Charles and Harriet remain in England perfectly happy and united. So what I hope some of this rather condensed and brisk summary relates are the numerous times in which the foreign other in the novel is supplanted by larger and greater English ideals. For as scholar Ewa Chung states, quote, Richardson situates his characters within a complex construct of domestic and social relationships that consistently portray and dictate one familial community in which the virtuous English bond together in opposition to foreign contamination and violence, end quote. Although Sir Charles is described in the novel as a citizen of the world, his long residence abroad has only endeared him more to his religion, his government, and his England. And there are numerous examples throughout the novel of how Englishness triumphs over what Chung calls foreign contamination and violence. For example, Harriet is most vulnerable and is kidnapped when she attends a continental European-style masquerade ball at which she wears foreign clothing such as a white Paris net sort of cap, a Venetian mask, a waistcoat with Spanish embroidery, and a scarf of white Persian silk and an Indian fan. Additionally, Grandison literally disarms Sir Hargrave and Mr. Greville through his ideals of English tolerance. The love between Clementina and Sir Charles grows as he teaches her English, and Sir Charles ends up with Harriet because she's an English woman who more closely reflects his own cultural and religious background, and the Della Porretta family's appearance at the end of the novel is resolved only after Clementina agrees to marry an Italian and return to Italy with the rest of her family. Chung notes that scholars such as Sylvia Marx have argued that Richardson maintained political tolerance and an unbiased temperament in his treatment of the Catholic Italians in the novel, but a close reading of the various interactions between the English and Italian characters, as well as the resolution of their affairs, reveals the novel's principal mission to ward off the threat of cultural merger. And while Peter Saber posits that while Sir Charles Grandison is ostensibly the most international of Richardson's novels, it's also the one that most firmly delineates the boundary between England and abroad. And such a delineated boundary between English and the foreigners is graphically dramatized on the novel's list of principal characters as well. As you can see here, the characters are divided as men, women, and Italians, and are further hierarchized by the numerous Italian men and women listed above the Italians, graphically triumphing over them. Betty Schellenberg, Janine Barkas, and other scholars have noted that Richardson's fondness for paratextual devices such as dramatis personae, indexes, footnotes, and other explanatory text helped him assert authority and control over the interpretation and reception of his novels, since as their printer, he had the power to control these elements. Here, particularly, we see how such graphic devices can be used to reinforce notions of Englishness. Catherine Temple elucidates further that even the Book of Grandison itself became an emblem of the English nation, as it was the only novel held at the newly National Library at Cambridge prior to 1780. Rebecca Ann Barr notes that while it seemed impossible for any novel in the period to receive more praise than Richardson's previous novel, Clarissa, Sir Charles Grandison was the subject of numerous poetic panegyrics, which asserted Grandison as the, quote, this last great work which leaves all praise behind, end quote. So while my previous work on Grandison's focused on the representation of the Italians in the novel, as well as the situation of the novel's piracy by Dublin printers and booksellers ahead of its London premiere and Richardson's reaction to the piracy, understanding Richardson's framing of Grandison as a pervasively English novel has led my more recent work to look at its reception in Germany and the role Richardson played as both printer and author in negotiating its production. As Clara Linklater Thompson states, quote, Richardson's influence in England was small compared to what it was on the continent, end quote. My main reason for turning to the continent, and in this example, Germany, is to analyze whether or not Richardson maintained control of his novel as being English when that was no longer the language his text was being read in, as well as to think through what this kind of nationalistic control means for larger understandings of the novel as both a material object and cultural artifact, and the impact of Grandison's Englishness abroad. As I continually encountered Richardson's influence on nearly every major German author in the latter half of the 18th century, it became clear to me that the German obsession with Richardson, especially Grandison, was not just an admiration for an esteemed foreign author, but that the German reception of Richardson and his work was deeply and significantly integrated within Richardson's project of English nationalism, right at a time when Germany's own fraught and non-existent national identity began to take a more public and literary presence. So think back to the 1779 German Crusoe that has instructions for colonialism for the Germans. Such an international interest in his writing would have caused a great deal of anxiety for the author-printer Richardson, who's often categorized as a control freak, seeing how he had no copyright protection of his novel on the continent. And in an attempt to retain control over his work as it passed outside of the boundaries of copyright and authorial control, Richardson had to work collaboratively with booksellers, publishers, and translators to remain involved in the dissemination and presentation of his work. And this was to an extent unusual among professional authors of the period. And I'd like to discuss what this collaboration looked like in the case of the German translation of Grandison, as well as this translation contributed to what many prominent German authors, such as Christoph Martin Wieland and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, described as Grandison fever. Richardson interacted extensively with Philipp Erasmus Reich, who was one of the most important booksellers of the German Enlightenment. Reich operated the Weidmann Publishing House in Leipzig and was also Germany's greatest importer of English and Italian books. In his study of Reich, Mark Lamstedt relates that he was often referred to by his contemporaries as the Grandison of booksellers, which refers to Grandison's superhero-esque traits of success and universal amiability. But further to that point, Norbert Schurer notes that Reich and Richardson's alliance was natural as both men shared a common interest in improving the quality of books as material objects and in establishing uniform copyright laws across their countries. For the translation of Grandison, Reich recommended to Richardson Christian Fürchtegott Gellert, a German poet and novelist who greatly admired Richardson's writings. Richardson's Pamela in particular was the basis for Gellert's novel, The Life of the Swedish Countess of G, which was published in 1747. In a May 1754 letter to Richardson, Reich writes that the English edition of Grandison, quote, has been received with as much admiration and pleasure by my countrymen as by your own, end quote. He then recommends Gellert as the translator, writing that Mr. Gellert is the only man perhaps in Germany equal to the task and has undertaken to translate it. And I flatter myself the original will lose none of its original beauties under his hands. Nothing but a Mr. Richardson could prevail me with to undertake this affair, he said to me. Here Reich appeals to Richardson through praise and admiration, glorifying his work and emphasizing the honor it would be for Gellert to translate the novel and for him to sell it. Ending the letter with another compliment, Reich writes, quote, the character of your writing gives me more respect for you than if you possessed all the empires in the world, end quote, an interesting use of colonial language to assert Richardson's superiority. The first parts of the first edition of the Gellert translation were published that same year, and the remaining volumes were published in 1755 with a high print run of 2,500 copies. Gellert certainly lived up to Richardson's claim that the original would lose none of its beauties under his hands, seeing how Gellert preserved and translated all of Richardson's numerous paratextual editions, which was not always the case for translated works in the 18th century. The preface to the novel is a translation of Richardson's original. The dramatis personae is kept, and Gellert even translated Richardson's concluding note by the editor, copy of a letter to a lady, an answer to a letter from a friend, all of which were appended to the end of Richardson's novel. Gellert did not add any material such as a translator's preface or his name on the title page, nor did he remove any of the text as it was presented in the English edition off of which he worked. As seen here, the title page in the German has a high level of graphic verisimilitude to the original in English. Later German editions of Gellert's translation also often contained an author's portrait of Richardson. Thus, Gellert's presentation of his novel meant to act as a literal German rendering of Richardson's novel, paying homage to him and his greatness, rather than representing the translation as a new product of the translator, as was common in the 18th century. And I'd like to note here, too, that that's basically the opposite of what happened with the French translation of Richardson's novels, which is an entirely different story, but this wasn't like typically how translation worked in the 18th century, and certainly not the translation of Richardson's novels. Though the German title page's verisimilitude to the English edition may have been a decision made by Reich and Gellert, Richardson found ways to have more authorial control over the various illustrations of many of the German editions. For example, a year later in August 1756, Reich visited London with the sole purpose of meeting Richardson to discuss the production and sales of Grandison in Germany. While Reich was visiting, Richardson suggested to him a number of figures who could serve as the subjects for an upcoming collection of 21 engravings meant to be added as illustrations to a later German edition of Grandison. These engravings by Martin Bernegeroth are, in Schurer's opinion, excellent examples of Richardson's cooperation with foreign booksellers to influence the interpretation and reception of his novel, here through a choice of subjects for illustrations. Furthermore, this situation shows Richardson's desire to reinsert the English body within his novel, even after it loses the English language that initially defined it. His protagonists retain their Englishness through the representation of English models in the translated edition. And as an interesting kind of personal note, I'd like to mention that I have a copy of this edition with the German engravings on its way. I purchased it from a German antiquarian book dealer who had to mail it to my sister who lives in Germany, in Munich, and she had to hold it before she could ship it to the US. And she's mailed it to me, but it's been delayed because of COVID. So it's just kind of been sitting in customs for a while now, and I'm starting to get really anxious, but I'm super excited to have my hands on a copy with some of these engravings. So two readers of this translated edition in Germany were Johann Goethe and his younger sister Cornelia Goethe, who's only recently become the object of research independent of scholarship on her brother. Johann Goethe's opinions of Richardson varied throughout his life, and such remarks are well documented and discussed by Goethe scholars, but less documented, however, is the relationship that Cornelia Goethe had to Richardson and to Grandison in particular. Following her brother's command that she should not read any novels except for those which he allowed, which included all three of Richardson's novels, Cornelia became an avid fan of Grandison. Gerald Baer notes that within the pages of Grandison, Cornelia found a model image of a beautiful and yet learned woman, confirmed in Richardson's Harriet Byron, and that this character mirrored her own ideal image as an educated young woman. To further illustrate this point, Cornelia wrote to her friend Katharina Fabricius in an October 1768 letter, quote, "I would give everything in the world to reach the point in a few years of imitating the excellent Miss Byron. To imitate her, mad that I am, can I do it? Then I would be a lovable girl. This wish remains in my heart day and night," end quote. Additionally, she writes that Sir Charles Grandison himself is such an excellent man, and more interestingly, it's a pity there are no longer men like that in this world. He was English, my dear, and I can believe that there are still some who resemble him. They are of that nation. I am so transported by those people. They are so amiable and serious at the same time, so one must be charmed by them. Not only is Cornelia's desire to perfectly imitate Richardson's Harriet Byron noteworthy, but it's also peculiar that her affections for Sir Charles are constructed through a recognition of and appreciation for his Englishness. Baer notes that she may have had an Englishman of her own to project her Richardsonian gentleman ideals upon via a man named Arthur Henry Lupton, who lived abroad in Frankfurt while he studied German from 1754 to 1768. Baer speculates Lupton served as the missing link between what the Goethes knew of the fictional England from literature and real English society. Johann Goethe noticed a small kind of flirtation between the two, but Cornelia's secret diary entries were much more serious, enthusiastically praising Lupton's good looks, his politeness, his charming wit, and his admirable violin play. Eventually, Lupton returned to England, leaving Cornelia heartbroken, and thus Cornelia becomes not Harriet in this situation, but Clementina, pining over an Englishman who returns to his country without her. Reading Cornelia's letter to Katharina alongside her diary entries on Lupton reveal how the English figure in the illustrations to her German translation of Grandison came alive via Lupton and captured her desires through his Englishness. The efforts made by Richardson to continually have his novel represented as English, even after it had been translated, allowed for such interactions. There are also external instances of Grandison's influence in Germany, such as Johann Karl August von Musaeus's 1760 novel Grandison II. The novel is a satirical yet favorable treatment of Richardson's novel in which the protagonists are in decides to imitate Sir Charles Grandison, whom he sees as a paragon of all virtues after countless readings of Richardson's novel. In a way, Sir In's imitation of Sir Charles mirrors Cornelia Goethe's desire to imitate Harriet Byron. To fully realize this imitation, Sir In attempts to convert his sleepy section of northern Germany into an exact replica of Grandison's English society. The bewildered townsfolk then find themselves renamed as their English counterparts in Richardson's Grandison, and Sir In's neighbors, some of whom are completely illiterate, find themselves forced to join Sir In's scholarly music and art appreciation societies despite their complete boredom. Eventually, the community erupts into violence, and Sir In's fantasy of replicating Grandison's idyllic life is shattered. It's important to note, while Grandison II remains rooted in parodic intent throughout the novel, it's not Richardson or Sir Charles Grandison that's parodied. Rather, I argue that Moussois's novel exposes the inability of the Germans in Sir In's community to match the elegance, sophistication, and politeness of the English society he so fervently admires. Try as he might, Sir In cannot be Sir Charles. Just as Richardson exposes the Italians as primitive rather than sophisticated and worldly, positioned in the historical past of barbaric and unenlightened practices, Moussois's novel thematizes the self-reflexive cultural inferiority of the Germans through a failed attempt to imitate the English. Sir In's hope to be transported to a Richardsonian happy ending through an imitation of Englishness, like Cornelia Goethe's, remains unfulfilled. They both remain European others. Even the first real German epistolary novel, The History of Sophia Sternheim, written by Sophie von La Roche in 1771, features a pervasive admiration for the English and English sensibilities. The protagonist, Sophie von Sternheim, had an English mother from whom Sophie has inherited all of her good traits, first and foremost her mother's sense of charity. Additionally, Sophie is bilingual and speaks perfect English, which is unusual in the 18th century when French was the lingua franca, not English. And this skill comes in handy when Sophie courts two Englishmen while they're on vacation in Germany, eventually marrying the English Lord Seymour and establishing a school for women in her mother's name. Christoph Martin Wieland, who acted as the publisher for La Roche's novel, publicly disparaged her obsession with the English in the novel's preface, claiming her, quote, "little partiality to the English nation is a flaw I would fain have erased from this excellent work, had it been possible to do so without too great alterations," end quote. My work continues to think about these translations, receptions, and adaptations of English novels within German contexts. The history I've outlined today regarding Richardson's Sir Charles Grandison raises profound questions for contemporary Richardson scholars. Peter Saber notes that to Sir Charles's fantasy of an England united with Europe, Richardson might answer with E.M. Forster's "no, not yet, no, not there." Such anxieties about England and its relationship to other European countries are at the pinnacle of the Brexit debate of our current moment. As a novel about the English Union to ward off cultural others from Europe, with an accompanying strange, successful life in Germany where it is presented as English and cherished because of its Englishness, I find it difficult to read such strands of Grandison's bibliographic life as being unrelated to ideas about English superiority, which are all the more pressing in our current moment. Although previous scholarship has addressed how the various ideological implications embedded within the plots of Richardson's novel can be read as complicit in contributing to the nationalistic pride that was later instrumental to Britain's colonialism, my work seeks to inspire new book history-oriented research that centralizes the bibliographic role of Richardson's novels as material and cultural objects in fostering ideas about English superiority and British colonialism around the world. And yeah, that's what I've been up to recently. So I'm happy to answer any questions.